Hi, and welcome to today's presentation of In Depth with the new AASL School Library Standards, Digging Deeper into Engage. I am Paige Bradenkamp. I'm the School Library Consultant at the Wyoming State Library, and I will be facilitating today. We are going to look at the Shared Foundation Engage today. And if this is your first time joining us, we're glad to have you. This is the sixth and last webinar in the series. And it started with the standards overview. All of the recordings are available on the AASL standards playlist on the Wyoming State Library's YouTube channel. Jennison Lucas is here, and she will be talking about Engage. And she is a Wyoming school librarian. She is the Wyoming AASL affiliate, and she is the chair of the AASL Standards Implementation Committee. And she will tell you all about Engage. Again, the sixth of the shared foundations for the AASL standards. And Jennison, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you everybody who's been kind of keeping up with us as we've gone through this journey over the last several months. If this is your first time joining us, welcome, and please consider taking a look at those ones that are up on YouTube to kind of get a little bit of a picture of what all we have been doing along the way. So as we get started today, we're going to start with the outline of our learning targets, a quick introductory review in case this is your first time accessing standard information about how to find the standards, some of the terminology. Then we're going to dive in and look closer at the Engage standards for learners. And then we'll end with looking across the frameworks to the librarian competencies and the library alignments. Before we get started, though, I want to make sure that everyone understands that although I am the chair of the Standards Implementation Committee, and we're using AASL slides, this is not an official AASL presentation. The work that is in here is based on what I have learned as I've been looking at the standards, reading through the book, working on my own professional development. And I will have a couple of things I'm going to mention about AASL as we go through today, but just to let you know that this is my information and I'm doing it for the Wyoming affiliate, just so that we're clear on that. So let's start with accessing the standards. There are three ways to actually get into our standards. One of them is by using the hefty volume. If you're an AASL member, you can buy that from the ALA store for $99. I believe if you're not an AASL member, it's $199. So it's definitely worth joining AASL there for that as well. There's a lot of information in the book that goes a little bit more in depth than just the standards. It talks about some of the policies and AASL positions. There's an appendix that talks about each of those different standards. I've been using it just to find policies and position papers as well as standards information. There is an app that is $19.99 that includes all three of the frameworks, the learner framework, the school librarian framework, and the library alignments. It does not have as much extra stuff as the book has, but it definitely gives you at least the access to the wordage of the standards themselves. And then, of course, there's the standards portal at standards.aasl.org, and from there you can find a free downloadable copy of the learner standards. There's all kinds of other information, one-page documents to help explain to your parents, to your administrators, to your colleagues about what these new standards are. There's a lot of different places of engaging. They do have a calendar that is listed on there so that if you want to see what the official AASL standards events are, you can check that out. You can also look to see what the affiliate ones are. I think I may have forgotten to put this webinar up on their calendar, but other affiliates around, which an affiliate, if you're not familiar with that term, is a different state that is associated, a state department associated with AASL. They have different webinars and Twitter chats and all kinds of things going on that'll be on that. We just did an AASL Twitter chat on the standards at the beginning of May, and we're going to be doing a slow chat, an official slow chat, which is going to have some questions to go through the book or the app and do a little bit more in-depth look at some of the questions. I think that's going to start after annual. So we do have some things that are going on. There's lots of stuff if you look out on Facebook and things where people are doing their own discussions and book studies and things like that as well. So there's lots of ways to get involved with learning the new standards. So some terminology. First of all, throughout this whole process that we've switched from talking about students to talking about learners. And in that learners, we are including our colleagues and our administrators and everybody that is around us because we are lifelong learners. So we are also learners in this case. Trying to figure, there they are. Common beliefs are those things that are the basis of what we believe as librarians. Our standards are based upon those common beliefs and refer back to them. The shared foundations are our top level of the standards. These are there are 6 shared foundations. They are inquire, include, collaborate, curate, explore, and engage. So each of the webinars that we've done in this series for Wyoming have been based around each of those standard foundations or shared foundations. Then there is a key commitment that goes with that shared foundation that is the statement that explains what it means to engage, for instance, for today. Under each shared foundation are 4 domains of think, create, share, and grow, which of course are what we want our students to do. I sometimes think of it as a depth of knowledge, but they're a little bit more than that as well, that they're looking at different ways that we see information. And then competencies are actually what our standards are. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too, that the standards are competency standards, not outcome standards. And then when we talk about the library part, it's in alignment with our library, what we used to call programs. We're trying to move away from that language, although I think a lot of us are finding it hard to talk about our library and everything we offer without calling it a program because we've called it that for so long. But how are these competency standards aligned with what we should have in our library, and how do we get our libraries to help us support those standards? So this is a quick look at all 6 of the shared foundations and key commitments. Today we're going to be focusing on that one at the end of engage. And I have to say that when I first saw this layout and saw these shared foundations, I was all excited about that idea of engage and the idea that, oh, I love these, just looking at the shared foundations, because I teach in choir. I always try to include everybody. Collaboration is the best way for our learners to learn, so we should be on that. Curate is what we do in our libraries. We gather information. Exploring is what I want my students to do, to be able to go out there. But then engage hits me a little bit differently, because in some ways it feels like it includes all of those other 5. In fact, and so we're going to talk about that again in a second as well. And then here's our domains with a little circular thing to show how each of those domains are kind of embedded in all of our shared foundations. All right, so I'm going to come back and talk library class rules. This goes with why I thought Engage was so exciting. When I first started as a school librarian and had to put up my list of rules on the wall, I was thinking really hard about what I wanted it to be, and that my rules became this: listen and engage appropriately, respectfully, and nicely, so that if you read the bold down the side, we are going to be learning in the library, because that's what it's all about, is learning. And I used that word engage, and every time that I sat down to talk about our rules, I would have kids snickering in the corner talking about how they're not old enough to get married, they're only in elementary school. And so I kind of keep thinking about that, but we'd had to explain that engaging means to interact, and it means to really get into it and really look at the way that, how are we learning, and all of those pieces of that puzzle. And so I thought I'd include this slide in there a little bit, because it is about engagement. And libraries should engage our students in all of the learning. And then looking at what the Engage Shared Foundation means, it is about appropriately, respectfully, and nicely. So I was a little bit ahead of that time in 2002 when I created this plan. So here's the Engage Foundation: to demonstrate safe, legal, and ethical creating and sharing of knowledge products independently while engaging in a community of practice and an interconnected world. There is so much to unpack in this idea of course, demonstrate safe, legal, and ethical creating, but then, and we're sharing knowledge projects, and we have to do that safely, legally, and ethically. And we want our kids to be able to do that independent of us, independent of teachers, because they're engaging in a community of practicing and an interconnected world. There's so many ways that we share information now that it's not just about our school reports anymore. And we want them to be able to do this every minute of every day as they're constantly engaging with information. And see that word engage pops right up in there again as we talk about it, because this in my mind is what we are getting our kids ready for. So here's the list of all of the competencies that come across. We're going to look in depth at each of those competencies, deconstruct them a little bit to look at what do they mean, and then how does that look at each different grade level. But this is a look at how it will look in the book, in the documents where you'll see the competencies shared. So first we have to talk about the outcome versus competency. I have talked about this in all of my other webinars, that idea of a lot of people have been asking about benchmarking, about how do we know if they've mastered it, what does this mean? And there's not going to be a benchmark from AASL because these are competency standards. And where this fits is that the picture on the screen I think of more as an outcome. We have all the pieces to the puzzle and we're going to put them all together. We're going to learn how to do a jigsaw puzzle, and when we're done we're going to have the picture of the puzzle. And every time that you do a jigsaw puzzle, you might do it the same way. It's going to have the same outcome. You're going to have a picture at the end. The picture might be different, but the whole process and what you're going to have as a product at the end is always going to be a completed jigsaw puzzle. Whereas competency standards I think of more like Legos, because there are so many different ways that you can put those same pieces together and create something completely new. And so how I teach this in my 5th grade class is going to be different from how I teach it in my 3rd grade class, how I teach it in my kindergarten class, how it might be different in our in middle school and in high school, but we're still using the same pieces and they can all go together in different ways. So that's part of that. Our competencies are going to be, we can teach how to build with these Legos in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 10th, 12th, college. It should get more intricate over time. It should get more creative over time, but the pieces are the same. Okay, so now let's take a look at the competencies themselves. This is engage, think. This is our first domain. Our competencies start with this idea that learners follow ethical and legal guidelines for gathering and using information. And they're going to do this in 3 different ways: by responsibly applying information, technology, and media to learning. And deconstructing that competency means that we're going to have to look at what that means and what are those things that our kids have to be able to do in order to engage with that competency. So they're going to have to recognize that there's a correct way to share. There is a way to do it. It might not always look the same. It's not that there's one way, but there is a way to do it correctly, legally, ethically. Okay? They have to be able to define copyright, plagiarism, ownership, intellectual property, paraphrasing, any of those terms that go along with responsible use of technology. Terms of service, privacy policies, all of those things have to have definitions. They have to understand the basics of terms of use, that I created it, so I own it, but that means that I get to decide how somebody else uses it. In elementary school, explaining the difference between copyright and plagiarism is huge, because they're taught not to copy. They're taught that that's plagiarism, but then they get those 2 terms confused. And understanding that copyright is who owns the right to make copies of it, the person who created it owns it, And so now what can I do with it? Is my teacher allowed to make copies of my work and spread them out to everywhere? Or do I get a say in whether or not I let them do that? I may have some teachers who are irritated with me because I tell the kids that it's theirs if they create it and they get to decide whether the teacher's allowed to copy it or not. But that's okay because that's the way that the world is supposed to work. We also need to know when different information, media, and technology is most effective. So as you're applying information and technology and media to learning, you have to acknowledge that some formats are better than others for certain things. And you don't want to create a website for everything, or maybe it's not you're not going to find the answer in a video every single time that you go to look. You might prefer to watch a video, but that doesn't mean it's the best way to get your information. So then our next competency, number 2, is understanding the ethical use of information, technology, and media. So part of what you need to do to master this is to use information versus copying the information. I have some students in elementary school who tend to think that they can copy it and that's the same as using it. How else am I going to get that information? And not understanding that process of internalizing it, figuring out how to combine it differently. And it's not just about putting it in your own words, but what does that mean to me, and how can I express that in a different way to make it more meaningful? Understanding that we have different permissions for use. So we talk about this a lot, starting when I start my third graders talking about video or about images, and understanding that we can't just use whatever pictures happen to show up in a Google search. They're owned by somebody. We need permission. And now our third one, evaluating information for accuracy, validity, social and cultural context, and appropriateness for need. We need a knowledge of evaluation strategies. How do we evaluate different sources? How do we evaluate the information? How can we tell if it's accurate? How can we tell if it's valid? Like, does it match? I have educated friends on Facebook who will share articles that they come across and make comments on it as if it were happening now and not realize that the article is 5 years old. And so it's not actually valid for the point they're trying to make, just because of that time thing. Understanding how to place resources in cultural and social contexts. And some of this might even be things like understanding political cartoons. What is that cultural or social or political context that this information is being shared in? And that's part of evaluating as well. And then recognizing that appropriateness to your need and audience is important. So you can find information that's perfectly accurate, perfectly valid, and have nothing to do with the point that you're trying to make. So you don't want to include it because, it doesn't fit in what you're talking about. So if I'm talking about ice cream flavors, the fact that mint chocolate chip ice cream is usually green may not have any bearing on that, because it's not about the flavor, it's about the color. Okay? So now we'll take a look at what this might look like across different levels and how this works as a competency. So for instance, in kindergarten, we have to learn to know that we learn from what we see, read, and watch. We gather information from observation, from reading, from listening, all of those things that we see around us, and that we want to match that information to a task. This in kindergarten could look like, if I say, when did that happen, I'm expecting some sort of a time word as an answer, is a way to match that. Or if I'm asking for what did it look like, I need some picture words to go with that, matching that information to a task. And then understanding that all things have been created by somebody else. I've had teachers tell me that kids in kindergarten can't learn this idea of giving credit. And of course they can, because they can learn that, hey, somebody created that, so now we have to say who created that. Was it a book? Was it a person who told me that? You know, or who it is. Did somebody draw that picture? That's the illustrator. That's where this fits. By 5th grade, we should be recognizing the ownership of resources and seeking them out so that we know who owns the resource. Knowing when to use different mediums, moving that into the, is this going to be better written as a poster? Is this going to be better created as a website? Evaluate sources for information, accuracy, and appropriateness. And this one I took that 3rd competency and kind of narrowed it down, because we can teach 5th graders how to tell whether it's accurate and whether it's appropriate for their purpose. This gets a little sticky with 5th graders who want to think that appropriateness is whether or not it's okay for school, whether or not it's, you know, bad words or bad pictures. But teaching them that it's more of that appropriateness for their particular task at hand, along with those things, because obviously those are also important. And then by 5th grade, they should be able to define copyright and plagiarism and be able to explain why those are important. By 8th grade, we should be recognizing and crediting ownership of those resources, knowing when to use different technologies. And this, of course, is going to have been being taught. We're going to kind of, I would think that by 8th grade, we shouldn't have to spend as much time talking about that in class. Evaluating resources and info for accuracy, appropriateness, and validity. So we're going to add to that by 8th grade. We're getting used to looking for information about that, so we can add to it. And then by 8th grade, we should also be respecting copyright in all mediums. So I put a little bit, I start teaching in 3rd grade about appropriate use of images and sources and things like that, but there are definitely some teachers that kind of push back on that a little bit, that those kids are a little too young. At least that's what they think. And I think that might be because they're not sure how to teach it. Because this is new and this is a domain of librarians to be able to talk about that. By 10th grade, recognizing and crediting the ownership of all resources. Appropriately choosing sources and tools, saying, hey, I think this would be better for me to do a video and be able to show that or share that. And evaluate sources or information for accuracy, validity, social and cultural context, and appropriateness. So by 10th grade, we should be starting to do all of that standard and being able to pull all of it in, because it's getting to the point that they're going to be very close to graduating and needing to be able to take that to its independent stage. Okay. So let's take a look at create. Our competencies here start with the idea that learners use valid information and reasoned conclusions to make ethical decisions in the creation of knowledge, which, wow, that's a pretty tall order, just to think about that particular part. And they're going to do that by ethically using and reproducing others' work. Looking at that under a deconstruction would be, first of all, they have to understand when they can use other people's work. It kind of goes in with that understanding that if they didn't create it, it's owned by somebody who did. Knowing how and when to credit another's work that you can use. So first you have to figure out whether you can use it, and based on ethics, based on appropriateness, all that stuff, and then how to credit it and give them the credit that's due. The idea of seeking permission before sharing and reproducing others' work. This is going to be an interesting one to talk about as we talk about the older kids and using social media, and when you push share, is it okay, or do you have to ask permission if you can share? All of those things are part of that as well. And then our second one is acknowledging authorship and demonstrating respect for the intellectual property of others. So deconstructing that, we have to know how to correctly cite the work of others. We have to be able to define intellectual property. What does that mean to own the intellectual property? I have a cousin who is a digital copyright lawyer, and she does a lot. I will contact her and ask questions occasionally. I follow her on Twitter and watch the things that she's talking about, and this idea of what is intellectual property and what you can claim as yours versus what kind of falls into the public domain or the general sense of culture is kind of contentious at times. Understand ways to share authorship. So if Paige and I are both putting this presentation together, mostly with her helping from the technical side, but that doesn't mean to me that she's any less important in this process. So knowing how to share that authorship of this whole creation of a webinar. If I had a partner who was helping me create all of the content, it would be how do we share that? How do we share that and decide who is going to be talking at what part, and how do we let our teachers know how much we did, and kind of all of that is part of it. Our third competency is including elements in personal knowledge products that allow others to credit content appropriately. This is claiming credit for our own work and being able to say, hey, wait, I created that, and making sure people know how. Make sure that we include information to allow others to credit our work. So if we don't sign it, if we don't put the appropriate information so that somebody else can give us credit, then they're not going to. So it's part of, hey, how do I make sure that my name is on that poster so that somebody can cite what I said about it? So in kindergarten, this looks like, first of all, we have to recognize that stories, art, etc. are created by people. So all of those things that we engage with in our learning environment have been created by someone. And that's a pretty basic thought, but we can certainly be talking about it. Then learning how to recognize the author, the artist, the creator. Who is it that wrote this book? Who is in charge of the pictures for it? Who is the person who created this sculpture that we're looking at? Who is it that put this whole thing together, this presentation together for me to watch? Who are the people involved in making a video? And that's an important thing to say, hey, wait, let's watch those credits and talk about the fact that all those people at the end were involved in this process. And I think that most of our teachers would love to see that we have an actual standard about putting our names on our papers, because this is how we claim ownership. And we do a lot of kind of pushing kids that you have to put your name on that paper so that I know that it's yours and so that I can give you the right grade. And this might be why we have such a hard time getting kids to write their names on their papers. If we rework that a little bit and ask them to claim it, hey, you worked hard on this, don't you want to claim it? This is a beautiful picture. Don't you want people to know it was yours? Kids will put their name on paper. Kids have no problem writing their names. My son is 5. He writes his name on everything. So, maybe it's that, hey, don't you want to claim it? That'll help. And we can absolutely start that in kindergarten. By 5th grade, they should be understanding that the author, artist, or creator needs to be credited for their work. That, just describing it's not really fair, and that we want to get credit for that ourselves. Learning proper citation techniques. And this really can start in kindergarten. I have a teacher this year that I was just kind of floored by what she was doing with our kids. We did a research project, and I was pretty much in control of the things that they were using when we did our project. And so I knew what their sources were. And she did something separate with them and had them take a picture of the books that they used. And like she had them doing something specific with books. I was using some online sources. But she had them take a picture, and they had to have a bibliography page that had a picture of the books that they used. This is a great way to start citation in much lower grades without worrying about where the period goes in a proper bibliography. That idea of, hey, I'm going to give credit, and the chances of having your kindergarten and 1st graders spell the title and author correctly is pretty slim in some cases, but being able to add that, hey, here's a picture, is a great way to do that. And then, of course, in 5th grade, we should be claiming our own intellectual property by including authorship info, making sure our name is on our paper, making sure that we have put a spot explaining who we are and what our purpose was, or any of those things, whatever we think we need to claim ownership or creation rights of what we've created. And then learning how to claim work through Creative Commons. And I thought about this as I put it up here, that I do start talking to my kids about Creative Commons in about the end of 4th grade and into 5th grade. We don't really learn how to claim it online, but knowing that there are ways that they can claim that and help get some of that validity and background of making it official if they're going to be publishing online. And now with 5th grade, we run into some of the age ethics of what you should be putting out on the internet, and they're not supposed to be using social networking sites yet. Almost all of those have an age of 13 because of the COPA laws, but still learning that it's out there and learning that that's the way to do it. And then as they're working with parents and teachers and things, they have that idea in their minds, which is why I stuck it into 5th grade. Although it might make more sense to be really talking about that at the older levels. By 8th grade, understand and give credit for others' work and understand how to give credit. Using proper citations for all resources, so we're moving up to not just books, websites, whatever, but citing our emails, our Facebook posts, Twitter exchanges. Claiming their own intellectual property consistently, I should have added that word. Understanding the ethics involved in sharing information. By 8th grade, they're going to be using social media. I mean, we all know that by 3rd and 4th grade, they're using social media, but we know that the age availability of that is hitting about 8th grade. So making sure that they understand that sharing that news article comes with some ethical repercussions, perhaps, or some ethics that need to be considered, such as, is it true? Have we evaluated it? Did we read it before we reposted it? If it's an image of our friends that they posted up on their wall, do we have rights to share it out with our friends? Because maybe they wanted to share it with us, but they don't want my friends to share it because that's friends of friends. And then having that added into, what if they share it and now our friends of our friends of our friends, we're into total strangers. So do we want that shared, and what are the ethics of that as well? By 10th grade, we should be consistently giving proper credit for other people's work, claiming our own intellectual property consistently, understanding the ethics involved in the sharing of information, and making good choices when sharing and citing information. So I consider this part of making sure that we are saying where we got that information. If we're going to put up a little quote on Facebook, make sure that we really do know who it came from. Part of that is also understanding when it's funny, you know, like the quotes that get put up about you can't believe everything you read on the internet as a quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln, right? But knowing that some of that is sharing for fun and some of it is we want to make sure that we're not disseminating false information. So moving into share, our competencies, there were only 2 listed under here, but learners responsibly, ethically, and legally share new information with a global community. This is definitely where our kids are growing up, and some of this scares us as adults a little bit, but our kids live in a global community. So our first competency, they're going to be doing this by sharing information resources in accordance with modification, reuse, and remix policies. And deconstructing that means that they have to know how to find the policies for terms of use those policies in determining the use of information. I actually had to look up what remix meant for myself. That might be a term that kids know, but understanding what all that means. Knowing search techniques for finding proper use. So if you're using a search engine, going in and doing a filter for licensing rights, for instance, on images, or figuring out how to find the information that you need within a database or within a website. So finding those proper use policies. And then our second one is disseminating new knowledge through means appropriate for the intended audience. So we need to know how to gear our presentation to an audience. The way that we present it to a kindergartner should definitely be different from how we present it to a 5th grader, to an 8th grader, to a 10th grader. There are definitely times that 10th graders would enjoy getting it presented to them as a picture book format like we would probably do for a kindergartner, but they would want it to be a story that was a little bit more in-depth. We need to match the audience to an accessible presentation. There are definitely things that are easier to do, say, in a webinar, or that are easier to do in person than in a written paper or an email. And understanding the right way to share that is part of this as well. Understanding that new knowledge needs to be shared. It's not good enough to just learn it and keep it in your head. This is the reason that we have assessments, right? So that they can have that opportunity to share what it is that they've learned. But they should be doing that along the way and have that opportunity to share just in normal conversation, to share what they've learned as part of doing their project, not always in the end product. So know various ways to share knowledge learned, both as final products and part of collaborative activities. So there needs to be strategies taught on how do I make sure that my input on this topic is heard, know how to share that with everybody that is on my in my group, figure out how to share it with my classmates, with my teacher, with my parents, with the school board, with city council, with the people that I think need to know it. Okay, and then across the levels, engage, share. In kindergarten looks like saying where the information was learned. Did I get this from a book? Did my mom tell me? Did I see it in a movie? And then beginning to learn the difference between talking with friends and grown-ups. I've added into this some of that formal versus informal language, and that there are some ways that we start to talk as we talk to a teacher, as we talk to a principal, as we talk to grown-ups. It's different from when we're just hanging out and chatting with our friends. And being able to see that difference in books and talking about it. In 5th grade, they should be starting to have an understanding of that formal and informal language, that when you talk to your buddies, it's different than when you're presenting to the school board. Correctly citing contributions to learning should definitely be part of this. And then learning how to find and understand those terms of use policies. In the Common Sense Media Digital Citizenship curriculum, this lesson comes in 5th grade. So that we can, and that's what I've been using to teach. So we start talking about that. Although I've noticed that I start referring to it in 4th grade and even in 3rd grade sometimes, so that they at least know that it's there, and that understanding how to do it. And then matching your sharing style to your audience. So figuring out that, hey, kindergartners tend to be more engaged when we're talking to our buddies if I have a picture. And then of course, in 5th grade, they're more engaged if there's a picture too. So having that as part of what they need to know as they start to present their information. By 8th grade, they should be choosing formal versus informal language appropriate to their audience and knowing when it should be both ways. Because if they're presenting to their class, they may think that informal is okay because it's their buddies, it's their class. But knowing that using formal language in that type of presentation would be better. Consistently citing contributions to new learning correctly, letting people know where that comes from. Using the terms of use policies consistently, and then matching that sharing style to audience again. By 10th grade, we should be consistently choosing appropriate communication styles for our audiences. Citing contributions, citing contributions to new learning correctly, and consistently seeking and abiding by that terms of use policy. So before you go and share their information, make sure that that's an appropriate use of their images, of their videos, however that works. Moving into engage, grow. The competencies are that learners will engage with information to extend personal learning by 1, personalizing their use of information and information technologies. And this is so key to what we want our kids to do. We want them to become lifelong learners. And this is why I love this GROW domain across all of them, is that how do we teach them how to connect to what else is happening in their world? So this first one of personalizing use of information, they have to recognize that ethical use of information is not a school-only skill. This is a lifelong skill. This is not an, I'll just do this because my teacher says I have to, but that you should be doing it all the time in everything that you use information for. Recognizing that information processes and technologies may be used in multiple settings. Just because you used a website at school doesn't mean you won't use one at home. Finding a podcast, it's not just something that the teacher did to help get you engaged. They actually exist out there in the real world for fun. So recognizing that. And then use learning about proper sharing and disseminating of knowledge in personal endeavors. So take what I've learned about sharing, what I've learned about taking the information that I know and share it with other people. So if I'm talking to my friends and I say, well, according to this book that I read, tell them the title of the book as you're going about it. You don't need to do a whole bibliography citation while you're chatting with your buddies, but being able to give that extra little bit of credit to the person that you're talking about is good. Our second one there is to reflect on the process of ethical generation of knowledge. Probably somewhere in one of these constructions, I probably should have put define ethics as one of the things that we need to do. But considering ethical use of information in all use of information. So making sure that we're thinking about what is the right way to do this so that nobody is going to get hurt, so that I'm giving people credit where it's supposed to be, so that I'm sharing things according to appropriate use guidelines. It should be in any time that we're using and sharing information. Knowing techniques of formal reflection of process. So having a toolkit of questions to look at our to look at what we've been learning and be able to say, oh yeah, that I'm going to answer these particular questions and say, oh wait, how did I learn that? What do I think about it? How am I going to share that? What's the best place? Our third one is to inspire others to engage in safe, responsible, ethical, and legal information behaviors. I loved this one, but boy, is it got to be hard to assess when you come down to it. So one of the things that we have to do is to remind others to follow ethical and legal guidelines. This may include knowing how to talk about it to other people. And it's like, hey, you know, that might not be the best way to do that. Or quickly remember, did you ask to share that picture of everybody from that party? Because so-and-so may not want that up on the internet. Remember, she doesn't post pictures. Things like that. Encourage others by example to use information ethically. So when you post up a quote, give credit to the person that it's from. When you post up a picture, shared with permission, any of those kind of things might be a good way to do that. Engage, grow across the grade levels is going to look in kindergarten, a lot of observation. Kindergartners need to observe teachers and others using information ethically. If teachers are never saying where they got their information, if they're never showing where they got their pictures, if they never say that this video came from YouTube or it came from this presentation software that we have access to or whatever, that's not really teaching the kids the right ethics. So using that. Giving them a chance to discuss where we share information and how we share information, and discussing ways in which we learn and knowing the ways that we share information. Oh, wait, we can get information from a video, from a song, from a podcast, from a book, from a magazine, from a newspaper. Just having those conversations. And in kindergarten, it's going to be observation and discussions. By 5th grade, they should begin to use proper ethics of use in school projects, because that's where we can control it. And if we can control them learning how to do it at school, they'll eventually learn to be doing it outside of school. But then this is where we start discussing, how do we share information in everyday encounters? How do you tell your best friend how you learned how to do that thing that you did from Taekwondo. You know, how do you teach how to play a video game? Where did you get that information and how are you going to share it with them? Discuss ways in which we should share information in ethical ways. If you just say, hey, I saw it on YouTube, that's not necessarily helping your friend find that same information. You'll need to be more specific on whose channel. Can you give me the title of the video that you watched? Can you show me how you found it? By 8th grade, using information ethically and legally in school projects, because again, this is where we can control it, at school. Hopefully it's going to be starting to be ingrained in them that this is the way that we do it. And I have not included that observe teachers use information ethically in the 5th, 8th, or 10th as it's coming up. But obviously that needs to be part of that as well, that we should always be modeling it, showing it, talking about it all the way through. So also in 8th grade, we should be discussing ways that we share information ethically in everyday encounters. Hey, when you shared that on Facebook, did you have permission? Let's talk about what that looks like. And if you didn't have permission, how close is that to maybe, are you bullying that person because you were doing it because it was funny and they didn't really give you permission? And having those open discussions is part of how we're going to have our kids behave ethically. Encouraging, by example, non-academic ethical use of information. And this gets a little bit tough, but if you have a class Twitter chat or you have a school-based social media platform that kids can use as you post to those, you're using that non-academic ethical use of information, and that trying to give them some way of being able to see and interact with you. And I debated about putting that there as well because that's a little bit more on the teacher side than what the kids are doing, but there needs to be a way that we can interact with our students and show them that if they're interacting with my Instagram account, I'm following ethical guidelines so they can see how to do it. And Instagram is definitely more non-academic than an official paper or presentation. By 10th grade, consistently using information ethically, sharing ways in which we ethically share information, so giving them a chance to be the ones who are having that conversation and not just us modeling it by this point. Encouraging others to ethically use personal knowledge creation. So as you're creating your own stuff, you're getting interested in your own things, you're starting to share out about barrel riding and how you got involved in it and how you learn more and all that kind of stuff. How are you doing that ethically? And then just overall in this idea, I was thinking about how do we show what engage looks like? And the first thought was this bibliography. And I've done a lot of thinking about this, that this is what we think of when we think about ethical use of information. We think about this, how do we create a bibliography? And I've had conversations with 4th grade teachers because our Common Core says that students are going to be including bibliographies. And I've had teachers who've looked at me and said, but they can't do that yet. And it's like, wait, yes, they can. It's not really that hard. They may not do it in as much depth as we might like, but they have to be able to tell you where they got their information. And so actually teaching this is incredibly important, and being able to talk about MLA, APA, there are different ways of doing this, here's how we should, is definitely part of it. I also came across this cartoon, which I thought was hilarious. So I would have done a bibliography, but my sources prefer to remain anonymous. Yeah, you might need different sources. Anyway, but it is also more about sharing. There we go. There's my picture. And it's about sharing, and it's about all of those different ways, videos and resharing and remixing and putting it up in an RSS feed, or getting it from a book, or putting it on the cloud, or in social media, and we're going to share this information in a graph, in an infographic, in a webinar, in a podcast. All of those things are engaging with information. This whole webinar series that I've been doing has been an amazing way for me to engage with this information of these new standards. Paige and I were talking before we went live about just the idea that for my own personal learning, having this webinar set up that we're going to do this series and we're going to do one a month gave me a deadline. It gave me this is what you're going to be thinking about when. It gave me a timeline of looking at things. So just personally, that was a strategy of being able to engage. Being able to sit and talk about it has been amazing for me to be able to put my thoughts into words. I hope they've been helpful words as we've gone around this, because a lot of it in some ways is my rambling and my making sense of it myself. But hopefully this gives you a chance to be able to say, oh yes, this is a way that we can look at that standard and how we can deconstruct it, how I can look at it for my kindergartners. My third graders are going to be somewhere between kindergarten and fifth grade. Oh yeah, I know my eighth and ninth graders. This might be a way to look at it. You can also disagree, of course, with what I've said and said that doesn't quite match what I know from my kids and my population. But now that I've seen how she thought about it, this is how I can think about it. And we're engaging in the conversation, and we're engaging in the learning that needs to go on so that we can help our learners. Assessment has to happen as well. So our formative assessments, we have exit tickets. Again, what is the ethical use of this? Is this something you're allowed to do or not allowed to do? Maybe even scenario based. I put up here monitor sharing on a school-related social media. So being able to say, wait, this is an okay way to say this. This might not have been the nicest way, because ethics are also about right and wrong. And so some school-related social media might be any engagement with a school-based Instagram or Twitter account. It might be Destiny Quest. It might be blog responses or things where you're interacting on Goodreads or any of those places where you may be able to share online. Class discussions, just having that discussion and talking about it and allowing kids to participate. You might do it with Poll Anywheres and then generate a discussion group based on answers. Role-playing scenarios. Hey, if this was yours, what would you like this person to do with it? Those kind of examples might be good. On the summative side, which is more of the where you're going to get your grades, might be formal, and I put annotated in there in parentheses because some might be, some might not be, but an annotated bibliography can help address that evaluation piece. I chose this source because this is how I showed that it was valid. This is how it pertains to what I'm talking about. This is how I know it's trustworthy. So all of those pieces, and I've explained it. Journals and logs are a chance to reflect and use that reflection piece of saying, this is how I know that this is okay or not okay. Final products and presentations, of course, are ways for you to check to see if students are actually using that ethical sharing and citing and all of that sort of stuff. Maybe even some surveys so that you can present a scenario and see what people think about it. And then maybe even assigning a reflective paper to go back and say, hey, did I follow good ethics as I use this? And that could be a little bit more formal way of checking. So looking across our frameworks, we'll start with, I picked in here this time the create domain. And on the learner, we've already looked at that. Learners use valid information and reasoned conclusions to make ethical decisions in the creation of knowledge by acknowledging authorship and demonstrating respect for intellectual property of others. The school librarian competency then is that school librarians act as a resource for using valid information and reasoned conclusions to make ethical decisions in the creation of knowledge by requiring complete attribution to acknowledge authorship and demonstrate respect for the intellectual property of others. And I want to say that from the school librarian perspective of this, we are often the person in our buildings who are the expert on how to do this. I have encountered in the years that I've taught a lot of teachers who've come to me when they've started their master's degrees and said, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me? Can you teach me how this works? So we act as that resource for everybody in our building, and that's really powerful. And then, of course, our school library alignment. The school library supports ethical processes for information seeking and use by promoting the responsible use of ideas, information, media, and technology through compliance with copyright and intellectual property policies developed by the school librarian in collaboration with members of the school community. So this is that chance for the school library to be promoting all of these ideas and policies with the school librarian, hopefully collaborating with school board members, etc., to actually create those. And then it all ties it into how are we making sure that our students are engaged. So that gets us to a spot where we can ask if we have any questions.
The recording will be available on the Wyoming State Library YouTube channel as well as the Wyoming State Library website. If you go to Webinar Archives under Trainings, you'll be able to find a link to the recording, as well as all of the previous recordings in this series. If you haven't watched the previous ones, I encourage you to do so. They're fantastic, great ideas, great information, great presenter, and a local Wyoming school librarian. So what's not to enjoy about that?
Well, like I said, thank you for supporting my personal professional development.
Yeah, go school librarians!
Woo-hoo!
So,
Lifelong learners, let's stay engaged.
definitely, that is perfect to wrap this up.